Welcome to IPMWORKS e-learning modules. My name is Per Kusk and I'm a professor at Aarhus University in Denmark. This video is part of Module 2, Plant Health Risk Challenges and Policy Context in the EU, and it will present Chapter 4, New and Future EU Legislation on Pesticides, and a closer look on the IPM principles. A very significant EU legislation recently was the European Green Deal. The European Green Deal was approved in 2020, and it is a roadmap for making the EU climate neutral in 2050 and the EU economy sustainable in the future. It consists of 8 policy areas, which are shown in green in the figure to the left. One policy area, and the one which is of most interest in the context of IPMWORKS, is the From Farm to Fork strategy, which pursues the issue of food sustainability, as well as the support allocated to the producers. That means the farmers and fishermen, who are the producers of food in the EU. The Farm to Fork strategy has a number of targets which should be reached in 2030. And they are shown on this map. And as you can see, they encompass the use of antimicrobials, the emission of greenhouse gases, the use of fertilizers, but also the transition to organic farming. But of most interest in the context of IPMWORKS and pesticide use is the one which requires a 50% reduction of the use and risk of pesticides in the EU in 2030. And it actually consists of 2 parts. One is an overall reduction in the use and risk of chemical pesticides by 50% by 2030. The other one is a reduction in the use of the more hazardous pesticides by 50% in 2030. And by hazardous pesticide is meant the candidates for substitution. In Chapter 2, I presented the grouping of pesticides in the EU. And as you may remember, it's split up into 3 groups, and one of these groups are the candidates for substitution, which are considered to be more hazardous than other pesticides. Now, to reach these goals, the EU Commission has suggested or put forward a proposal for a regulation on the sustainable use of pesticides. You may remember that in Chapter 2, I presented the directive on the sustainable use of pesticides. And the proposal by the EU is to replace the directive on the sustainable use of the pesticides by a regulation on the sustainable use of pesticides. And why is that? Well, maybe first we should look at the difference between a regulation and a directive. A regulation have binding legal force throughout every member state, and it enters into force on a set date in all member states. So this is really EU legislation which immediately becomes national legislation. In contrast, a directive lays down certain results that must be achieved, but each member state is free to decide how to transpose directives into national laws. And I think it's fair to say that changing the directive on the sustainable use of pesticides to a regulation on sustainable use of pesticides reflects that the European Commission is not satisfied with the measures which has been taken by EU member states to increase the adoption of IPM by European farmers. And a number of independent reports have also reached the same conclusion, that the uptake of IPM in Europe in generally has been very poor. If we look on the background, as I already mentioned, the background for suggesting a regulation on sustainable use of pesticide is the observed difficulties in applying, implementing, and enforcing the Sustainable Use Directive. The objectives of the regulation is to reduce the use and risk of chemical pesticides, increase the application of IPM, and increase the use of less hazardous and non-chemical alternatives. Secondly, it is to improve the availability of monitoring data on pesticide use and health and environmental effects. Today, some countries have very detailed information about pesticide use, but many EU member states have very, very poor data on pesticide use. Thirdly, the objective is to promote the enforcement of legal provisions to improve policy efficiency. And lastly, the objective is to promote the adoption of new technologies, such as precision farming, to reduce the use and risk of pesticides. Now, if we take a look on the proposal, and it's important to remember it is still a proposal, and it has not been passed through or adopted by the European Parliament, and therefore there might be changes. But the proposal, as it looks right now, is suggesting legally binding reduction targets to achieve the farm-to-fork objectives. As you may remember, the overall objective or overall target was to reduce pesticide use by 50%. And this is also reflected in the regulation, but in the regulation, the targets vary between EU countries. So EU countries which have already made an effort to reduce pesticide use and where a reduction has actually happened, or EU member states which have a very low use of pesticides, they have typically been allocated a lower target than countries where very little had happened. A second objective of the proposal is to have a complete ban on the use of chemical pesticides in sensitive areas. And that is areas such as public areas, but it's also natural areas such as the Nature 2000 areas. And to obtain a better protection of aquatic environment and drinking water. And then it also applies for a total ban on aerial spraying. This ban on the use of chemical pesticides in sensitive areas may actually have significant impact in some countries where maybe even a very large part of the total area can no longer be treated with pesticides. A third objective is to enhance the use of IPM through records and preventive measures and interventions, crop-specific IPM rules, electronic IPM, and pesticide use register. So really what is intended is that much better data is collected on pesticide use, and that every farmer is supposed to upload information on pesticide use to a central pesticide use register. And also it implies that each member state will have to develop crop-specific IPM rules that the farmers would be obliged to follow. Another area of that the proposal will be looking at is that training certificates will be or should be issued for advisors, and also that it is important to ensure that advisors are independent. That means that they are free of any conflict of interest. Now, in many countries, advisors may also besides advising farmers, be selling pesticides. And of course, they cannot be claimed to be free of conflict of interest. But this is not the case in all countries. And basically, EU is requesting each country to make sure that advisors will be independent in the future. And also that advisors have a certificate, a training certificate that document that they have knowledge about IPM. And then there is also a proposal to have more comprehensive national action plans, and then the national action plans should be revised every 3 years, in contrast to now, where they're revised every 5 years. There's also a proposal to have an electronic register and inspection of application equipment for professional use, to make sure that there is an overview of what kind of equipment is actually used by the different farmers. And then lastly, there is it is proposed to introduce the harmonized risk indicator to measure the progress in reducing the use and impact of pesticides. The harmonized risk indicators were developed some years ago, and they will now, it is proposed that they will now be used to measure the progress of the farm to fork strategy, or the proposal for sustainable use of pesticides. And we do have two harmonized risk indicator, numbered 1 and 2. And the harmonized risk indicator 1 is calculated by multiplying the quantities of active substances placed on the market in plant protection products by a weighing factor. So basically, the way that the harmonized risk indicator is calculated is by looking on the amount of active substance sold each year and then multiplying that by a weighing factor. And the weighing factors are shown in the bottom of this slide. So the compounds, the active compounds, are divided into 4 groups. And you may recognize that the first 3 groups are the 3 groups which I described in chapter 2. It's the low-risk substances, the ordinary active substances, and the candidates for substitution. And then there's a 4th group, and that's the active substances which are no longer approved in the EU. And you can see that this weighing factor is very, very different. So, for example, using candidates for substitution will have a much higher impact on the harmonized risk indicator than using low active substances. But of course, one also have to remember that you're multiplying the quantities of active substance placed on the market by this weighing factor. And therefore, the harmonized risk indicator will also be very dependent on whether you are using products which are applied, for example, in kilos per hectare, or you are using products which are applied in gram per hectare. So a product applied in gram per hectare may be a candidate for substitution, but may actually have less impact on the harmonized risk indicator than a low-risk substance which might be used in kilos per hectare. The harmonized risk indicator 2 is calculated by multiplying the number of emergency authorization granted by member states under Article 53. And again, in chapter 2, I explained what these emergency authorizations are. And again, the same system is applied, that the number of emergency authorizations are multiplied by the same weighing factors as the ones which are used for the harmonized risk indicator number 1. And actually, this system is already in place, and it is possible actually to follow the development in the EU. How is the progress when it comes to the development of harmonized risk indicator 1 and 2? And here is an example which for harmonized risk indicator 1, which shows the EU trend in the user risk of chemical pesticides, where the overall objective is to reduce the use and the impact by 50%. And then the use of the more hazardous pesticides, where the overall target is a 50% reduction in use. And as you can, the reference period which has been chosen for this 50% reduction is the period from 2015 to 2017, That's the period which is shown in green in the figures here. So the average of these 3 years are the reference point. And as you can see, the trend when it comes to chemical pesticides in the EU is that there has already now in 2021 been a 33% reductions in the impact of pesticides, of the pesticide used in the EU countries. And these figures are updated every year. And if you're interested in following the development in the trends in the pesticide use and the harmonized risk indicator, you can just use this link which is shown in the bottom of the slide. You can see for the hazardous pesticide, the trend is a little bit different. So in 2021, which is the most recent data that we have, the reduction was 21%. So there's still some way to go to reach the 50% reduction. It's also possible to see how the trend is in different countries. And here I've just shown two examples of two neighboring countries, Austria and Germany. And as you can see, and this is it's not in any way to expose Austria or Germany, but just to show that the trends in the different countries can be very different. And you can see in Austria, there's actually been an increase in the harmonized risk indicator, whereas there has been a reduction in Germany. So the trends in the different countries are very different. Now, both the directive for sustainable use of pesticides and the new proposal for regulation on the sustainable use of pesticides relies very much on the adoption of IPM. IPM is really the engine which should lead to a reduced use of pesticides and impact of pesticides in the EU. And in chapter 2, I presented the 8 IPM principles that was part of the Sustainable Use Directive. And I will not go through them here, but what I will do is I will just refer to a summary of the IPM principles made in a publication published back in 2015 by Bartman and colleagues, and say that the 8 principles represents a logical sequence of events. So basically, the first principle deals with what can be done before actually establishing the crop. And then the following principles are chronological in the sense that first you need to monitor the pest, and then if you have a pest problem, you have to use thresholds, for example, or other kind of models to assess whether any kind of intervention is necessary. And then the following principles deals with the interventions. And then finally, the principle 8 closes the loop by ensuring that users look back and assess their actions in view of improving the entire process. So it is really a logical sequence of events, and these IPM principles has been criticized by many people that they are putting much a lot of effort on the direct control methods of pest rather than focusing on prevention and suppression. Only one principle, the principle 1, deals with the prevention and suppression. The other principles deals basically with aspects of direct control of pests. Another way of looking on how you can move agricultural production towards a more sustainable system is to look on the efficiency substitution redesign paradigm, abbreviated just the ESR paradigm. And this paradigm basically says that there are 3 steps when you want to move to more sustainable agriculture, which, for example, could be adopting IPM. And the first step is focusing on efficiency, and that could typically be, when we're talking about agriculture in Europe, to improve the efficiency of chemical inputs. So that could be dose optimization, not to use higher doses than needed, but it could also be precision spraying, so still relying on pesticides, but only applying pesticides to the parts of the field where pesticides are required. Now, the next step in to move towards sustainable agriculture would be to look on substitution. What can be used instead of pesticides? And this is also an aspect which are considered by many farmers today. Resistant varieties, we're growing resistant varieties, for example, is a common way of reducing the occurrence of diseases. Biological control, for example, to control pests and diseases in glasshouses, is widely adopted. In open land agriculture, the use of biological control is less widespread. Mechanical weeding has been studied very much over the last years as an alternative, as a substitute to herbicides. But in conventional farming, mechanical weeding is still not used very widely. Cover crops would be another example of introducing measures which can substitute the use of pesticides. So IPM, or you could say agriculture in Europe, is very much focused on efficiency or substitution. But what this paradigm really is saying is that really to make fundamental changes and to move to sustainable agriculture and adopting IPM, it is necessary to take the third step, the redesign step. And this is basically about redesigning our agroecosystem to be less vulnerable, to be more robust. And that could be, for example, a more diverse crop rotation, but it could also be landscape management. Make sure that fields, for example, are surrounded by natural areas where beneficials thrive and therefore can interact with pests which occurs in the field. But this redesign has not really been taken very much up by farmers so far in Europe. And this is really an area which have achieved a lot of focus in the ongoing project IPMWORKS, where we have defined or we have decided that what we are moving towards is a holistic integrated pest management. And the way we have tried to illustrate what we understand by holistic integrated pest management is shown in this figure. So if we start to the left, you can see that the first 2 clouds here actually deals with redesigning. It deals with redesigning cropping systems, crop rotations, and it deals with redesigning landscapes. And in both cases, the overall purpose is to decrease pest pressure, either by preventing pests from being a problem or by suppressing pests which are present in the crops. Then there should be focus on non-chemical pest control, and if pesticides are needed, then of course there should also be focus on increased chemical efficiency. And then finally, improved decision making is very, very important, and decision support systems is in many ways really the tool to improve decision making. And IPMWORKS works closely together with another EU project, IPM Decisions, where the main focus is to develop a platform for decision support systems. Now, if you look on this overview of holistic IPM and try to compare it to the 8 IPM principles, then you can see that actually the first two, they're dealing with redesign, and which, as looking on the ESR paradigm, should be the final goal of moving towards more sustainable system, is actually a very, very important part of holistic IPM. 2 of the 5 clouds is actually focusing specific on IPM principle 1. Then we have the non-chemical, which is dealing with IPM principle 4. Then we have 1 cloud, which is actually covering the IPM principles 5, 6, and 7. And then finally, the improved decision-making, which is IPM principles 2 and 3. So you can see, if you have a view on holistic IPM, you have much more focus on IPM principle. And this is the way that we believe that integrated pest management should develop in the future, having more focus on redesigning, and that means IPM principle, making IPM principle 1 the backbone of IPM, and then the other principles only being relevant in the cases where direct control is actually needed. Thank you very much for your attention.